The last thing I remembered was a car crash on I-95, a cup of gas station coffee, and a playlist I never got to finish. The first thing I felt in this new life was someone slapping me across the face. Not gently, not by accident. Hard. Get up! A voice snapped above me. The Crown Prince's welcome ceremony begins in 2 hours, and you look like something a wolf dragged in from the rain. I opened my eyes. Wrong ceiling. Wrong room. Wrong everything. The ceiling above me was high and coffered, ivory and gold, with a chandelier dripping crystal light across stone walls. My bed was massive, ridiculous honestly, draped in deep navy silk with a crest stitched into the headboard. A wolf mid-leap, crown above its head, 13 stars circling it like a warning. I sat up slowly, cataloging the damage. New body. Check. Slightly malnourished. Underfed. Carrying bruises along the left ribs like someone had made a hobby of it. Check. Head full of someone else's memories pushing against mine like water behind a cracked dam. Check. The woman glaring down at me had sharp eyes and a sharper uniform. Dark gray attendance dress, silver pin at the collar, clipboard in hand. Her name surfaced from the borrowed memories flooding my skull. Mrs. Hargrove. Head of palace staff. Loyal to the king. Hates Eli on principle. Eli. That's me now, apparently. Elijah Weston. Third-born Omega son of King Douglas Weston of the Callaway Pack Territory, New Hampshire. 17 years old. Publicly designated useless at age 12 when his secondary gender presented as Omega with no documented gifts. No strength. No speed. No alpha authority. Nothing the pack respected, wanted, or acknowledged. The forgotten prince. I ran my tongue over my teeth. Felt the ghost soreness of a jaw that had been clenched too long, too often, and looked Mrs. Hargrove dead in the eye. You just slapped a prince, I said. She blinked. I want that on record, I added pleasantly. For later. Her mouth tightened. You have 2 hours, Your Highness. I suggest you use them wisely. Got it. I swung my legs off the bed. You can leave now. She left. Stiffly, furiously, and fast. Which told me Eli had never spoken to her like that once in his short, bruised life. That changes today. I stood at the window while Eli's memories settled into me like sediment after a storm. New Hampshire in October. The Callaway Pack Territory stretched across 3 counties of dense forest and private roads, with the capital Ashford City, sitting at its center like a fist. Pack law, pack hierarchy, pack everything. Alphas at the top, betas in the middle, omegas at the bottom, and royal omegas in a special subcategory I could only describe as decorative. Eli had spent 5 years being decorative, ignored at pack council gatherings, overlooked at formal dinners, handed off to tutors who stopped showing up after month 2 because, quote, the Omega boy doesn't retain information. What they hadn't known, what nobody had bothered to figure out, was that Eli retained everything. He just retained it differently. I picked up the silver hairbrush from the vanity, and the moment my fingers closed around the handle, it hit me. Flash. A memory. Not mine. Mrs. Hargrove, 2 nights ago, speaking in a low voice to someone near the east corridor. The king wants the Omega out of the welcome ceremony entirely. Too embarrassing. A pause. The Crown Prince's people agree. I set the brush down. So, the king wanted me invisible. The Crown Prince, Rhett Callaway, Alpha Heir, 22 years old, reportedly brilliant and reportedly brutal, had apparently co-signed that decision before even meeting me. That was the superpower nobody had figured out yet. Psychometry. Touch anything and the truth bleeds in. Every hand that ever held it. Every secret spoken near it. Every lie wrapped around it like ribbon. I had grown up in a different life reading people, fixing problems, outthinking rooms full of people who underestimated me because I was quiet. In this life, I could literally hold an object and download its entire emotional history. And they called Eli useless. I dressed without help, choosing the plainest outfit in the wardrobe. A soft gray fitted shirt, dark trousers, boots that actually fit, and walked out of the room before anyone came to escort me somewhere smaller. The palace hallways of Ashford Manor smelled like cedar and cold stone and something else underneath. something layered and warm and unfamiliar. I followed it without meaning to, the way you follow a song you can't place but already know. I turned a corner near the East Gallery and stopped. He was at the far end of the hall, back half turned, speaking quietly to a man in a dark security uniform. Tall, wide-shouldered, dark hair. The kind of stillness that didn't come from calm, it came from control. From someone who had learned early that if he moved wrong, things broke. He hadn't seen me yet, but something shifted. His head turned, just slightly, like a sound had reached him that hadn't reached anyone else. And in the half-second before our eyes met, I caught his scent. Pine, rain-soaked cedar, and something underneath it. Something that hit the back of my throat like a chord resolving after too long out of tune. Oh no. His eyes found mine across the gallery. Cold, sharp, unreadable. Rhett Calloway. He stared at me like I was a problem he hadn't been briefed on. I stared back like I hadn't just felt the ground tilt under my boots. Then I smiled, bright, unbothered, borderline offensive, and walked the other direction. Walking the other direction lasted approximately 14 seconds. Because the East Gallery was a dead end. I stood in front of a wall of framed portraits, generations of Weston royals staring down at me with varying degrees of disappointment, and took a quiet breath through my nose. Okay, so that was less smooth than intended. I turned around. Rhett Calloway was still at the end of the hall. He hadn't moved. He hadn't looked away either, which was somehow worse. The security guard he had been speaking to was gone, leaving just him, arms loosely at his sides, watching me with an expression I could not decode from this distance. I walked back toward him at an easy pace, chin up, like I had simply gone to admire the portraits and was now returning. Perfectly intentional, completely unbothered. He let me get close enough that his scent hit me again. Pine and cedar and that other thing underneath, warm and low and unreasonable, before he spoke. You're Elijah Weston. Not a question. More like a conclusion he had arrived at reluctantly. Guilty, I said. And you're the crown prince who tried to cut me from the welcome ceremony before we ever met. So we're already off to a great start. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise. More like recalibration. Who told you that? He said. Flat. Controlled. I smiled without showing teeth. A little bird. He studied me for a moment the way people study something they expected to be simple and aren't. His eyes were dark. A deep gray-green that shifted depending on where the corridor light caught them. Up close he was more composed than he looked from a distance, and from a distance he had already looked like a man who had never once panicked in his life. You should be preparing for the ceremony, he said finally. I am prepared. You're standing in a hallway. I'm a fast dresser. I glanced at his uniform, formal black, silver threading at the collar, the Calloway crest at the chest. Sharp, precise, the kind of outfit that said I was born knowing how to wear this. You, on the other hand, look like you've been awake since 4 in the morning. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You don't know me. No, I agreed. But I'd like to. That landed differently than I meant it to. Or maybe exactly as I meant it to. I was still negotiating that internally. His scent did something when I said it. Not stronger exactly, but closer, like something in him leaned forward even though his body didn't move. I needed to not notice things like that. Cleared my throat. I'm going to be at that ceremony, I said, keeping my tone easy and direct. Just so we're clear. Not to embarrass anyone. Not to make a scene. But I'm not going to disappear because it's more convenient for everyone if I do. Rhett looked at me for a long beat. No one said you had to disappear. No one had to say it out loud. Another beat. This one felt heavier, like something was being weighed inside it. The ceremony is formal, he said, and his voice had shifted slightly. Still controlled, but with a texture to it I hadn't heard in the first sentence. Pack delegates from 6 territories will be present. Any disruption will not come from me, I said. I'm Omega royalty, not a golden retriever at a black tie dinner. I know how rooms work. His mouth did something. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the shadow of one. There and gone so fast I almost missed it. Almost. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Nobody ever is," I told him. "That's usually their own fault." He held my gaze for one more second, and I felt it the way you feel pressure before a storm. Not quite sound, not quite touch, just the knowledge that something large was very close. Then he looked away, back toward the main corridor, and the spell or the tension or whatever that was dissolved cleanly. "The ceremony begins in 90 minutes, he said, professionally distant again. "Don't be late." He walked away without waiting for my response. I stood there watching his back until he turned the corner, and then I let out a slow breath through my teeth. Pine. Cedar. That warm, low note underneath. My secondary designation was Omega, and I had lived 32 years in a previous life, so I was not about to stand in a palace hallway being undone by a scent. That was embarrassing. That was below me. I was a grown man reborn into the body of a 17-year-old who had been slapped by his own staff this morning, and I had priorities. I turned back toward the east wing. A young attendant appeared at the corridor junction ahead, breathless, holding a folded garment bag with both hands. "Your Highness," he panted. "I've been looking everywhere. Your formal attire for the ceremony. Lord Harrington's office sent it up this morning." There was a note. He held out a small card balanced on top of the garment bag. I picked up the card. The moment my fingers touched it, the flash came, cold and fast and involuntary. "Lord Harrington. Yesterday afternoon." His voice low over a phone call. "Make sure the Omega looks like what he is. Forgettable. Soft. Nothing that draws attention." I lowered the card. Looked at the garment bag. "Open it," I said. The attendant unzipped it carefully. Inside was a floor-length ivory ceremonial robe. Shapeless. Plain. The kind of thing designed to make whoever wore it vanish into the background. I stared at it for exactly 3 seconds. "Burn it," I said pleasantly. The attendant blinked. "Your Highness." "Not literally. Just find me something else. Something dark. Something that says I exist." I turned back toward my room. "And bring me coffee. Real coffee. None of the herbal pack-approved nonsense." Behind me, the attendant scrambled. Somewhere ahead, the palace was filling with delegates, dignitaries, and wolves who had already decided what I was. They were all about to be mildly inconvenienced. The attendant's name was Caleb. I learned this because he came back 12 minutes later moving at a near sprint, slightly out of breath, carrying a midnight blue-fitted dress jacket with silver trim at the lapels and a pair of matching tailored trousers that actually had a waistline. "I found these in the storage wing," he said, laying them out carefully across the chair. "They belonged to Prince Marcus before he left for the Eastern Territory. They might need slight adjusting at the shoulder, but the length should work." I looked at them. Clean lines. Dark color. The kind of outfit that said I am in this room and I meant to be. "Caleb," I said, "you just became my favorite person in this building." He flushed pink to his ears. "I also found coffee, Your Highness. Real coffee. Black." I could have cried. I dressed quickly, shrugged the jacket on, and stood in front of the narrow mirror beside the wardrobe. The shoulder was slightly wide but not badly. The blue made the gold undertones in my skin look intentional. I looked less like the forgotten third prince and more like someone who had simply been biding his time, which, as of this morning, was accurate. Caleb hovered nervously behind me. "The ceremony entrance is in 20 minutes. Lord Harrington will be directing the processional order and—" "Where does he have me placed?" I asked. Caleb hesitated one beat too long. "Last," I said. Not a question. "The order reflects traditional rank by—" "Caleb. Last," he confirmed quietly. "Behind the Beta household staff." I picked up my coffee, took a long slow sip, and considered this information. Lord Harrington was my father's chief political advisor. 50s, silver-haired, with the particular brand of confident cruelty that came from years of being the smartest man in rooms full of people who were afraid to disagree with him. Eli's memories of him were mostly impressions. A dismissive wave, a turned back, a voice that never once bothered to lower itself when saying unkind things about the Omega Prince within earshot. I set down the coffee. "Tell me the processional route," I said. Caleb blinked. Your Highness. The route. Where does it enter? Where does it end? How many people line the hall? He told me, quickly, nervously, watching my face for information about whether he was about to be involved in something that would get him reassigned to the laundry wing. I listened to every word. The grand hall of Ashford Manor seated 300. Delegates from six-pack territories were already inside. The processional entered through the north corridor, walked the full length of the hall under chandelier light, and ended at the raised platform where the king and crown prince would receive formal greetings. Last in the processional meant I would enter alone. No buffer. Every eye in that room having already settled, having already done the math, having already filed me under Omega Thirdborn Irrelevant. Walking in last, I would be the most visible person in that room. Lord Harrington had miscalculated. Or he had never once considered that Eli might understand his own staging. Thank you, Caleb, I said. Go take a breath. You're fine. He exhaled like he had been holding it since birth. I walked to the north corridor with 4 minutes to spare and stood at the back of the processional line. The household staff ahead of me shuffled with mild surprise when they registered who had joined them. A few sets of eyes tracked sideways. A beta aide near the front whispered something to his neighbor. I smiled warmly at no one in particular and straightened my jacket. The doors opened. The processional moved. I counted my steps the way I had learned to count steps in boardrooms and depositions in my previous life. Steady pace. Shoulders back. Eyes forward. When you are the smallest person in a room by every metric anyone cares about, the only move is to walk like you designed the building. The hall was exactly as described. Chandeliers blazing. 300 seats filled with packed delegates in formal wear. Faces politely attentive. The king sat elevated at the far end, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, wearing an expression of ceremonial neutrality. Beside him, one step down on the platform, was Rhett. He saw me the moment I entered. I know because his posture changed. Not dramatically, just a slight resettling, the way water adjusts when something new enters it. I kept walking. The whispers started at row 4 and moved like a wave. Not cruel whispers exactly. Confused ones. Who is that? Is that the Omega Prince? He doesn't look. And then the sentence usually stopped there, unfinished, which was somehow better than any ending they might have given it. I reached the platform, bowed to the king with exactly the right depth, not shallow enough to read as disrespect, not deep enough to read as submission. Straightened, clasped my hands behind my back. My father looked at me with an expression I could only describe as interrupted. I smiled at him the way I had smiled at Mrs. Hargrove that morning. Bright, steady, borderline offensive. Then I looked at Rhett. He was watching me with that unreadable expression from the hallway. But something in it had shifted and I could not name what. His scent reached me even across the platform distance. Cedar and pine and that low warm note. And my pulse did something it had no business doing in a room full of 300 witnesses. Stop that, I told my pulse firmly. My pulse did not listen. From somewhere near the second row, Lord Harrington was staring at me with the specific expression of a man whose careful plan had just stood up, put on midnight blue, and smiled at him. I made eye contact with him briefly. Then I looked away first, which was ruder than looking away last, and he knew it and I knew he knew it. They were all recalculating. Good. That was exactly where I needed them. The recalculating did not take long. By the time the formal greetings concluded and the delegates moved from the grand hall into the reception corridor, I had collected 17 sideways glances, for poorly concealed whispers, and one openly hostile stare from Lord Harrington that I filed away for later like a receipt I planned to redeem. The reception was the part nobody told Omegas about because Omegas were not supposed to be at it. It was held in the West Parlor, a long room with tall windows overlooking the manor grounds. October light pressing gray and gold through the glass. Servers moved with trays. Pack delegates clustered in the careful territorial formations that always emerged at these things, alphas gravitating toward other alphas, betas forming the connective tissue between conversations. I took a glass of water from a passing tray, found a position near the window with a clean sightline to the whole room, and observed. This was the other thing nobody had figured out about Eli. He had spent 5 years being overlooked at exactly these kinds of gatherings. That meant 5 years of watching without being watched. 5 years of learning which alliances were performance and which were real, which smiles carried teeth, which handshakes lasted a half-second too long. And now I had psychometry on top of it. I was objectively the most dangerous person in this room. Nobody knew that yet, which was its own kind of weapon. "You're not circulating." The voice came from my left, low and even. I did not startle because I had clocked Rhett's approach in the window reflection 30 seconds before he reached me. His scent arrived slightly ahead of him, cedar and pine, that warm undercurrent that my hindbrain had apparently decided to treat as a priority notification. "Neither are you," I pointed out. "You've been watching the room from the east side for the last 10 minutes. We're doing the same thing." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite discomfort. More like the particular feeling of being accurately described by someone who was not supposed to be paying that much attention. He stopped beside me at the window, close enough that his arm almost touched mine. Not quite touching. "The delegate from the Harmon territory has been speaking to Lord Harrington for 11 minutes, I said conversationally. "That's too long for small talk and too short for anything official. Whatever they're negotiating, it's not on today's agenda." Rhett was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that," he said. "I notice most things." I sipped my water. "The delegate from Blue Ridge Pack keeps touching his left cufflink when he speaks to your father, which means he's nervous about something specific, not generally anxious. And the woman in the green dress near the fireplace is not actually a diplomatic aide. Her shoes are wrong. Diplomatic aides walk in those heels like they were born in them. She's security, reassigned into formal wear for this event." Rhett turned his head and looked at me directly. Not the recalibrating look from the hallway. Something newer, something with more weight behind it. "How long have you been doing that?" he said. "Doing what?" "Reading rooms." I considered several answers and chose the honest one. Long enough that it stopped feeling like a skill and started feeling like breathing. He was quiet again. Outside the window, the manor grounds stretched into tree line, autumn-stripped branches against a pale sky. Inside, the reception hummed and shifted around us. "My father is going to ask you to leave before the formal dinner," Rhett said. Not cruel. Just direct, like he was delivering weather information. "I know," I said. "You're going to refuse." "Politely," I confirmed. "But yes." He exhaled through his nose. Something that was not quite a laugh and not quite frustration but lived in the neighborhood of both. "You're going to make this complicated," he said. "Things that matter usually are." He looked at me again, and this time he did not look away quickly. The gray-green of his eyes in the window light was something I was going to have to actively decide not to think about on a regular basis. Starting now, starting immediately. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked. "The ceremony. The dinner. Being in these rooms. You had a quiet life before this." The word quiet landed with the particular weight of a word being used as a euphemism for something uglier. "You mean invisible," I said. He did not deny it. "Being invisible wasn't a quiet life," I told him. "It was a slow erasure. And I'm done being erased." Something crossed his face then. Fast, unguarded, there and gone in a single breath. It looked almost like recognition. The kind that comes from hearing your own truth in someone else's voice. Then a hand closed around my arm from behind. Not gentle. I turned. Lord Harrington stood at my shoulder, silver hair perfect, smile professionally pleasant, grip on my arm the kind designed to move someone without creating a visible scene. "Your Highness," he said smoothly, "your father would like a brief word." In the side corridor. Every instinct in my new body and my old soul said this was not a word. This was a removal. I looked down at his hand on my arm. Harrington's skin touched mine through the fabric and the flash came instantly, cold and electric. His voice, 3 days ago. "The Omega needs to be handled before the Callaway heir sees him. If they scent bond at this ceremony, it will complicate everything. The trade agreement depends on the Crown Prince's designation being matched to the Harmon girl. Everything depends on that match." The flash released. I stood very still. There it was. There was the real agenda under every door that had been quietly closed in Eli's face. I looked up at Harrington's pleasant smile with completely new eyes. Then I looked at Rhett. He was watching Harrington's hand on my arm with an expression that had gone very quiet and very cold in a way that had nothing to do with the ceremony and everything to do with something older and more instinctive than politics. "Tell my father," I said to Harrington with a smile that matched his perfectly, "that I'll be there in a moment." Harrington released my arm. He walked away. I stood at the window with Rhett's cedar scent wrapping around me like something I had not been asked permission to carry, and the knowledge of what I had just learned sitting in my chest like a stone dropped in still water. Rings spreading outward. Quiet. Inevitable. I did not say anything for a moment. Neither did Rhett. "Whatever he wants to tell you," Rhett said finally, his voice lower now. "You don't have to agree to it." I turned and looked at him. For the first time all morning, something in his face was not controlled or composed or unreadable. It was careful. Like he was holding something he was not sure he had the right to hold. "I know," I said quietly, and walked toward the side corridor with my spine straight and my pulse doing things I was going to have a serious conversation with it about later. The side corridor was narrow and lit by a single sconce that cast everything in amber. My father was already there. King Douglas Weston stood with his hands clasped behind his back, facing the wall like he had been studying the landscape painting hung there, though I doubted he was seeing it. He was a large man, broad through the chest, silver threading his dark hair at the temples. In Eli's memories he appeared mostly as a silhouette. A chair at the head of a table. A voice giving instructions to other people in rooms where Eli was technically present but functionally invisible. He turned when he heard my footsteps. He looked at my outfit first, then my face. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes recalculated, the same way Rhett's had in the hallway, the same way the room had when I walked the processional. Like everyone had loaded a different version of me and were now quietly updating their files. "You weren't wearing the ceremonial robe," he said. "No," I agreed. "I wasn't. Harrington arranged that robe specifically." "Harrington arranges a lot of things specifically," I said. "That's starting to concern me." My father studied me for a long moment. Whatever he had expected to find in this corridor, it was not this version of his third son standing in midnight blue looking back at him without flinching. "Elijah," he said, and his voice shifted into something lower, something that was trying to be fatherly but had clearly not practiced the register in some time. "There are things happening at a political level that affect this family. Arrangements that require everyone to play a specific role. The match with the Harmon girl," I said. Silence. "Not the comfortable kind." "Harrington told you," my father said. "Harrington touched my arm," I said simply. That was enough. Another silence, this one longer. My father's eyes moved over my face with an expression I had not seen in any of Eli's memories of him. It was not warmth exactly. It was something more complicated than warmth. Something that looked almost like a man realizing he had left something valuable out in the rain for 5 years and was only now checking to see if it still worked. "Your ability," he said quietly. "Psychometry." The word landed between us like a stone. "You knew," I said. He exhaled slowly. "I suspected. When you were 10, you picked up your mother's bracelet after she passed and you described her last morning to me in detail. Every word she said. Every room she walked through. I told myself it was grief. A child's imagination. My chest tightened in a way that belonged to Eli and to me both simultaneously. "You told yourself that for 7 years," I said. "I told myself that because the alternative was more complicated." He turned back toward the painting briefly, and in his profile I saw something I had not expected. Not cruelty. Not indifference. Guilt. The specific kind that has calcified over years into something that looks like coldness from the outside. If your gift had been documented, if the Pack Council had known, they would have taken you for assessment at 12. Pack assessment for psychometric omegas is not gentle, Elijah. They would have classified you as a political asset. Moved you into intelligence channels. You would have had no life that belonged to you. I stood very still. "So you hid it," I said. "I buried it," he corrected. "I made sure your assessment listed no gifts." I let them call you the forgettable one, the useless prince. He said those last two words like they cost him something to repeat. Because useless boys get left alone. The amber light held us both in it. I wanted to be angry. I had the anger available, fully loaded, ready to go. But underneath it was something worse than anger. Something that felt like understanding sliding into a wound that had been open for 5 years and finding the shape of the blade that made it. You should have told me, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. You were 12, he said. And then you were 13. And then the longer I waited, the more impossible it became to explain why I had waited. That is, I said carefully, the most relatable, terrible parenting logic I have ever heard in my life. He blinked. I'm not forgiving you, I added. I want to be very clear about that. But I understand the mechanism. That's different. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not what I expected. Everybody keeps saying that today, I said. It's becoming a theme. Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. It did not quite make it, but it tried. The match with the Harmon girl, I said, steering us back. Rhett doesn't know about it. Rhett knows there are political negotiations in progress. He doesn't know the specific terms yet. He's going to hate it. He doesn't have to love it. He has to agree to it. Has anyone asked him? My father looked at me with the expression of a man who had genuinely not considered that question a relevant one, which told me everything I needed to know about how this pack ran its most important relationships. The Harmon territory controls 3 water rights corridors and 2 northern trade routes, he said. This match stabilizes the entire Northwestern Alliance. It is not personal. It is entirely personal, I said, to the person being matched. From the reception parlor, muffled by walls and distance, came the sound of voices shifting into the formal register that preceded dinner announcements. Time was compressing. My father straightened. The almost expression was gone. The king had returned. Stay quiet tonight, he said. Let the dinner proceed without incident. I'll do my best, I told him, which was true. I would absolutely do my best. My best just did not always look like what other people had planned for. I walked back toward the parlor, and nearly walked directly into Rhett. He was standing just outside the corridor entrance, close enough that I pulled up short with barely 3 inches between us. His scent hit me full and immediate, cedar and pine, and that low warm note that my entire nervous system had apparently decided was important information. He looked past me toward the corridor, then at me. How long were you standing there? I asked. Long enough, he said. His voice was quiet, but his eyes were not. Long enough, he repeated. I held his gaze and did the math. The corridor was not close to the parlor. You could not accidentally overhear a conversation in there from the parlor entrance, which meant Rhett had followed me, or followed Harrington, or followed something he was not going to name out loud in a palace hallway with dinner guests 30 feet away. So you heard about the match, I said. His jaw tightened. I heard enough. How do you feel about it? He looked at me like that was an unusual question. Like feelings about one's own arranged political future were not standard conversational territory, which probably in his life they never had been. It doesn't matter how I feel about it, he said. That, I told him, is the saddest sentence I've heard all day. And someone slapped me before breakfast. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one that was closer than the one in the hallway this morning. More real, less guarded. Come with me, he said. I blinked. Where? Away from this hallway before the dinner bell rings, and we have to sit at that table and pretend this conversation didn't happen. I considered pointing out that following a crown prince away from a formal dinner was probably not what my father meant by staying quiet tonight. Then I considered that my father had hidden my gift for 5 years and called it protection, and decided I had met my obedience quota for the decade. Lead the way, I said. He took me through a door behind the north staircase that I had not registered as a door because it was paneled to match the wall. It opened into a narrow service corridor and then up a back staircase that deposited us onto a wide covered balcony overlooking the eastern grounds. The October air came in cold and clean and immediate. After hours of reception rooms and cedar and politics and amber-lit corridors, the cold felt honest in a way nothing inside had. Rhett stood at the stone railing. I stood beside him. Below, the manor grounds went dark and still into tree line, the last gray light pressing through branches that had given up most of their leaves. Neither of us said anything for almost a full minute. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That was the strange part. It had the texture of a silence between two people who had known each other longer than they actually had, which made no logical sense and was therefore something I was choosing not to examine directly. The Harmon match was finalized 3 days ago, he said finally. I was informed this morning, 2 hours before the ceremony. That's why you looked like you had been awake since 4. I had been awake since 4. I leaned against the railing, shoulders back, looking out at the grounds. Did they ask you? They informed me. A beat. There's a difference. There's a significant difference. I agreed. He turned his head slightly, looking at my profile. I could feel it the way you feel sunlight shifting, a warmth repositioning itself. You told my father that it is entirely personal, he said, to the person being matched. I did. You were defending me. I was stating a fact, I said. It happened to be in your favor. Why? I thought about that for a moment. Why had I said it? Eli had no reason to protect Rhett Calloway, a man who had agreed before they met to cut him from a ceremony, who represented everything the pack hierarchy had decided to value over someone like Eli, over someone like me now. Because someone should have said it, I told him. And everyone in that building who could have said it chose not to. He was quiet for a moment. The cold air moved between us, carrying cedar and pine in a way that felt less like a pack designation and more like something personal. Your gift, he said carefully. The psychometry. You heard that part too. Does it bother you when it happens? The question was so unexpectedly considerate that I turned to look at him directly. He was already looking at me. Up close in the low light, his eyes were more green than gray, and he was not wearing the controlled expression from the ceremony. He looked like someone standing outside without armor on and finding it less terrible than expected. Sometimes, I said honestly, when what I read is painful, when it belongs to someone who is already hurting and I didn't ask to know it. I paused. Most of the time it just feels like information, like a door that opens whether I want it to or not. That sounds exhausting. Knowing things other people don't usually is. He held my gaze and I held his, and the air between us was doing something I was going to need to have a full internal committee meeting about later, because it was not nothing. It was categorically, undeniably not nothing. I don't want the match, he said, quiet, direct, like he was testing the weight of saying it out loud for the first time. I understand the politics. I understand the territory. I understand what my father needs. He stopped. But I don't want it. Then say that. It's not that simple. I know it's not, I said. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying that somewhere in the process of deciding your future, your actual answer should be part of the conversation. He looked at me for a long time. Then he did something I did not expect. He reached out and put his hand over mine where it rested on the stone railing. Not grabbing, not demanding, just his hand over mine, warm and steady, like punctuation at the end of something that had been waiting a long time to be said. My pulse went absolutely haywire. I did not move my hand. You came to this palace today, he said softly, and in approximately 6 hours you have rearranged several things I thought were settled. I tend to do that, I said. My voice was impressively steady given that my entire cardiovascular system was staging a protest. I noticed. His thumb moved. Just once. A small slow arc across my knuckles that lasted maybe 2 seconds and rewired something at the base of my spine permanently. Then the dinner bell rang from inside, deep and resonant, rolling through the stone walls and out onto the balcony, like a hand separating two people who had been leaning toward each other in the dark. He lifted his hand from mine. We both looked straight ahead for one breath. 2. We should go in, he said. We should. I agreed. Neither of us moved for another 3 seconds. Then we did. And I walked back into the light of Ashford Manor with the ghost of his warmth still pressed across my knuckles. knowing with the specific certainty of someone who had lived one full life already that whatever this was, it was not going to be simple. It was not going to be fast. And it was not going to leave either of us the way it found us. The formal dinner was exactly as uncomfortable as a room full of pack politics and unfinished conversations could make it. The seating arrangement put me at the far end of the table, below the Beta household representatives, between a delegate from Blue Ridge Pack who kept touching his cufflink and an elderly advisor from the Northern Territory who fell asleep during the soup course. Rhett sat at the elevated end beside his father, 3 seats from the king, directly across from a young woman in a pale gold dress who I did not recognize but whose positioning at that table told me everything. The Harmon girl. She was beautiful in the deliberate way of someone who had been prepared for a room rather than simply arriving in one. Composed smile. Perfect posture. She laughed at something Rhett said, and the laugh was calibrated exactly right, warm but not loud, interested but not eager. I watched Rhett's face when she laughed. He smiled back. Politely. Professionally. It was the same smile he had given the Blue Ridge delegate during the reception. The smile of a man performing social function with technical precision. I looked back at my soup. The cufflink delegate on my left introduced himself as Representative Cole Avery from the Blue Ridge Pack and immediately began asking me careful questions about my father's position on the Northern Water Rights Corridor, which told me he had done his homework and figured out that the forgettable Omega Prince had been in a private conversation with the king 20 minutes before dinner. I answered him honestly but vaguely, which is its own skill, and watched the room while I did it. Lord Harrington sat 3 seats from my father, close enough to whisper and far enough to maintain deniability. He had looked at me once when I entered the dining room, clocked my continued existence at the dinner table, and returned to his conversation with the expression of a man revising a plan in real time. I did not touch anything on the table that Harrington might have handled. I was not ready for whatever that would show me. Dinner moved through its courses. The conversation at the elevated end grew more formal, more structured, shifting from social pleasantry into the kind of dialogue that was really negotiation wearing a dinner jacket. I tracked it from my end of the table in fragments, reading posture and pause more than actual words. Then dessert arrived, and Harrington stood up. The room quieted with the specific efficiency of people who understood that Harrington standing meant something was about to be announced rather than discussed. "If I may," he said, addressing the table with the practiced ease of a man who had been the smartest person in rooms for so long he had forgotten to check. "This gathering presents a fortunate opportunity to share news that will strengthen the bonds between our great pack territories." My soup spoon was still in my hand. I set it down. "The House of Weston and the House of Harmon are pleased to announce the formal intent to bond between Crown Prince Rhett Calloway Weston and Miss Serena Harmon of the New England Harmon Territory." The room responded with applause. Measured, warm, politically appropriate applause. I did not applaud. Not because I was making a statement. I simply could not locate the motor function for it in the 3 seconds after Harrington's words landed. Because what I was watching at the elevated end of the table was Rhett's face. He had not moved. His expression was composed in the way that a person's expression is composed when they are using every available resource to keep it that way and have none left over for anything else. His hands were flat on the table. His jaw was set. Serena Harmon was smiling at the room and then turning that smile toward him, and he turned it back at her, and it was the most technically correct smile I had ever seen a person produce. He had known this announcement was coming. He had told me 20 minutes ago on a cold balcony that he did not want it. And he was sitting there receiving the applause of 300 people for a future he had not chosen, wearing a smile built entirely out of duty, and there was nothing either of us could do about any of it in this room right now. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, careful sip. Fine. I was fine. This was not my wound to carry. I had known Rhett Calloway for approximately 6 hours, and whatever had happened on that balcony was a moment between two people in a cold dark. Not a promise, not a bond, not anything that had any claim on how I felt watching him perform acceptance of a future that was suffocating him in real time. I was fine. I was categorically not fine. The applause settled and dinner resumed, and I spent the remaining 40 minutes of it being a perfectly pleasant and entirely numb conversational partner to Representative Cole Avery. When the dinner formally concluded and the room began its gradual dissolution into smaller groups, I stood, excused myself, and walked toward the east corridor with the calm, purposeful stride of someone who definitely did not need air desperately. I made it to the corridor junction before footsteps came fast behind me. Elijah! I stopped, turned. Rhett was 3 feet away, and whatever composure he had been operating on for the last 40 minutes had worn thin at the edges. Not broken, but thin. His eyes had that quality again, the careful, unguarded thing from the balcony, except now it was wound through with something else. Something that looked like a man who needed to explain himself and did not know if he had the right. "You knew before dinner," I said, not accusing, just placing it between us accurately. "I knew this morning," he said, "before the ceremony, before I saw you, and on the balcony." "On the balcony," he said. I forgot. The words came out quiet, like he had not fully planned to say them that way. I looked at him. He looked back. "That is not," I said slowly, "a fair thing to say to me." "I know, because I was standing there perfectly fine before you said that." "I know," he said again. His voice was low and rough in a way it had not been all day. "I'm sorry. Are you apologizing for forgetting or for remembering?" He stepped closer, close enough that his scent wrapped around me completely, cedar and pine, and that deep warm note that had been following me since this morning like a question I had not agreed to answer. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. And then his hand came up and his fingers touched my jaw, just the edge of it, just the back of 2 knuckles against my cheekbone, and my entire nervous system stopped conducting normal business. "Rhett," I said. His name in my mouth felt like something I had been careful not to say directly all day. "I know," he said softly. "I know all the reasons." "Say them," I told him, out loud, "so we both remember them." He was quiet for one breath. His fingers had not moved from my jaw. "The match is formal," he said. "The announcement was made. The territories need it." "Yes. And you have been here one day." "Yes. And I don't know what this is." "Neither do I." His thumb traced a single slow line along my cheekbone and I felt it from my face down through my chest and all the way to the floor, and I was 32 years old in a 17-year-old body with a full lifetime of knowing better, and none of it was helping. "This is a terrible idea," I told him. "The worst," he agreed. And then he kissed me. Not long, not desperate, just his mouth on mine in the empty corridor, warm and careful and honest in the way that only terrible ideas ever fully are. When he pulled back, neither of us moved for a moment. Then from behind him, at the corridor entrance, came the specific sound of a throat being deliberately cleared. We both turned. Lord Harrington stood at the junction with his hands clasped, and his expression containing the controlled fury of a man who had just watched his most important political arrangement develop a very inconvenient complication. Beside him, holding a small recorder, was the woman from the dining room I had clocked as security wearing the wrong shoes. She was not security. She was press. And the small light on the recorder was red. Oh, I thought, with the particular clarity of someone watching a careful plan explode in slow motion. There it is. There is the shatter. The red light was small. The kind of small that was designed to be missed. A thumbnail-sized device in a woman's hand in a dim corridor. And if I had not spent the last 6 hours reading every room I walked into like my life depended on it, I would have missed it completely. I had not missed it. My mind ran the calculation in under 3 seconds. Reporter. Live recorder. Harrington standing beside her with the particular stillness of a man who had arranged the furniture before the guests arrived. The announcement at dinner had not been the move. This was the move. Document the complication. Use it as leverage. Either to control Rhett or to remove me from the equation entirely. Harrington had not miscalculated at the processional. He had been patient. "Your Highness," Harrington said, addressing Rhett with the smooth tone of a man holding all the cards and enjoying the weight of them. "I apologize for the interruption. Miss Vance is here representing the Pac Territories Press Association, documenting tonight's historic announcement." A pause timed with surgical precision. I was not aware there would be additional developments to document. Rhett had gone very still beside me. Not the controlled stillness from the ceremony. This was different. This was the stillness of someone deciding in real time which version of himself he was going to be in the next 30 seconds. I looked at the recorder. Then I looked at Miss Vance. She was maybe 25, sharp-eyed, uncomfortable in a way she was trying not to show. Her recorder hand had dropped slightly since the throat clearing, the red light still blinking, and she was watching Rhett with the expression of someone who had been pointed at a target and was now questioning the assignment. I filed that away. "Miss Vance," I said pleasantly. Her eyes moved to me. "How long have you been in this corridor?" I asked. "I was directed here by Lord Harrington approximately." "How long?" I said again, same pleasant tone. "For minutes," she said. "And before Lord Harrington directed you here, where were you stationed this evening?" She blinked. "The reception parlor." "And who requested your presence at tonight's event?" "Lord Harrington's office contacted the Press Association 3 days ago with credentials and—" "3 days ago," I said. The words landed in the corridor with the specific weight of something being placed deliberately on a scale. Harrington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 3 days ago was before the ceremony, before the announcement, before any of tonight's events gave a press presence any legitimate reason to exist. The invitation had not been about documenting the Harmon match. It had been about documenting whatever Harrington planned to engineer afterward. "The invitation predates the announcement," I said, still conversationally, still pleasant, watching Harrington's face with the same attention I had given the room at the reception. "Which means tonight's press presence was not reactive. It was arranged in advance. For a specific purpose." I tilted my head slightly. "Lord Harrington. What purpose was that?" The corridor was very quiet. Miss Vance looked between me and Harrington. Her recorder hand dropped another inch. Harrington smiled the smile of a man regrouping. "The PAC Territories Press Association documents significant political events. Tonight's announcement was decided 3 days ago," I said, "before the guests arrived, before the ceremony. And you placed a press credential in this specific corridor, not in the grand hall, not in the reception parlor, but here." I let that sit. "Why here?" Another silence. Rhett spoke. "Harrington." His voice was quiet, the quietest it had been all day, which somehow made it the most dangerous. "Answer him." Something shifted in Harrington's expression. The smile remained, but the confidence behind it had developed a crack, hairline thin, running through the foundation. "The Crown Prince's personal conduct on the evening of a formal political announcement is a matter of public interest," Harrington said carefully. "Particularly conduct that might complicate." "You set this up," Rhett said. "I protected this family's political." "You set this up." Not louder, just slower. Each word placed with the deliberate weight of someone who was done being managed. I turned to Miss Vance. "You have a choice," I told her directly. "You were pointed at this corridor as an instrument of someone else's agenda. That's not journalism. That's a prop." I watched her face. "Whatever you recorded in the last 4 minutes, you know it was obtained by design, not by accident. Your publication and your credibility are yours, not his." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she clicked the recorder off. Harrington's composure fractured cleanly. "Miss Vance, your credentials were issued under the condition. Under the condition that I document tonight's political events," she said, and her voice had found its spine. "Which I did. In the Grand Hall. During the announcement." She met Harrington's eyes briefly. "I don't have anything else from this evening." She walked past us both toward the main corridor without looking back. Harrington watched her go. Then he turned back to us, and the pleasant advisor mask was gone, replaced by something older and less managed. Not rage. Calculation. Cold, patient, furious calculation. "This changes nothing," he said quietly. "The match stands. The announcement was made before 300 witnesses. Whatever personal indulgences occur in palace corridors have no bearing on territorial agreements." His eyes moved to me with a precision that felt like something being measured for removal. "And a third-born Omega with a documented history of no useful gifts has no political standing to interfere in crown negotiations." He knew about the psychometra now. He had heard my father name it in the side corridor. And he was betting that I could not use it against him without exposing everything, including the fact that my father had hidden it for 7 years. It was not a bad bet. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the small card. The one Miss Harrington had given the attendant with the ivory robe this morning. The one I had read and pocketed before asking Caleb to find me something in midnight blue. I held it out toward Harrington. "I believe this is yours," I said. "I picked it up this morning." He looked at the card, then at me, calculating what I had read from it and how much I was willing to say. "Make sure the omega looks forgettable," I said softly, quoting his own words back to him. "Nothing that draws attention." I smiled. "You wanted me invisible before I ever walked into a room with the Crown Prince. Not because of the ceremony. Because you already knew what a scent bond between us would do to your match." Harrington stared at me. "You knew before we met," I said. "You knew from whatever assessment you had done on both of us that the bond potential was there. And you tried to manage it out of existence." I tilted my head. "How long have you known?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the corridor. "You have no proof," he said. "I have the card," I said. "And I have a very specific memory for detail." I tucked the card back into my pocket. "I am not your enemy, Lord Harrington. I genuinely am not. But I am also not going to be managed, removed, or made forgettable so that someone else's arrangement can proceed without complication." I kept my voice even. "The Crown Prince's future belongs to the Crown Prince. You can work with that or against it, but I'd think carefully about which one you choose." Harrington looked at me for a long cold moment. Then he looked at Rhett. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor. Quietly, without another word. The silence he left behind was enormous. Rhett stood beside me and neither of us spoke for several seconds. "He is going to make your life very difficult," Rhett said finally. "He was already making my life difficult," I said. "Now at least we've had the conversation." Rhett exhaled slowly. He turned to look at me and his expression was open in a way it had not been since the balcony. All the ceremony day composure worn through to something rawer underneath. "That card," he said quietly. "What else was on it?" I looked at him. "His handwriting," I said. "And the specific terror of a man who had spent 3 days trying to prevent 2 people from standing exactly where we're standing right now." Rhett held my gaze. Outside, somewhere in the manor grounds, wind moved through the stripped October branches with a sound like something exhaling. "What do we do now?" he said. I thought about my father in that amber-lit corridor. About Eli's 5 years of careful invisibility. About a card designed to make me forgettable and a robe designed to make me disappear and a recorder pointed at a palace hallway like a loaded question. "Now," I said, "we stop letting other people decide what we are to each other before we've had the chance to figure it out ourselves." Rhett was quiet for one breath. "That's going to cost us something," he said. "Everything worth having does," I told him. And for the first time all day, the careful expression was completely gone from his face. What was underneath it was not simple, but it was real. And real, I had learned in 2 lifetimes now, was the only thing worth building anything on. Real was a terrifying thing to stand inside. I knew this because I was standing inside it right now, in a palace corridor with cedar and pine wrapping around me like weather, looking at a man who had spent 1 full day dismantling every assumption I had arrived with, and my chest felt like a window that had been closed for years and was finally, cautiously being opened. "We should talk to your father," I said. Rhett nodded slowly. "Tonight. Not tomorrow. Not after the territories have had time to solidify the announcement into something immovable." I held his gaze. "Tonight. While it still costs less to change course than to stay on it." Something resolved in his face. The last of the day's careful composure falling away not into chaos but into clarity. The specific clarity of someone who had been waiting for permission to want what they already wanted. "Together," he said. I blinked. "What?" "We talked to him together." His eyes were steady on mine. "You said my future belongs to me. That applies to how I handle this conversation too." I am not walking into my father's study alone to dismantle a 3-territory trade agreement while you wait somewhere being sensible. I stared at him. That is either the most strategically sound thing you have said all day, I told him, or the most reckless. Probably both, he said. I respect that, I said. Let's go. King Douglas Weston's private study was on the 2nd floor, east wing, behind a door that Rhett opened without knocking because it was his father's study, and he had apparently decided that tonight was not a night for waiting to be received. The king looked up from his desk. He looked at Rhett, then at me, then at the two of us standing in his doorway side by side, and something moved across his face that was not quite surprise because I think on some level, in whatever part of him had watched Eli pick up that bracelet at age 10 and describe a dead woman's last mourning in precise detail, he had always known something like this was possible. Just not this fast. Just not today. Sit down, he said, not commanding, almost tired. We sat. Rhett spoke first. Directly, clearly, without the performance of deference that I suspected he had been trained into since childhood. He said he understood the political value of the Harmon match. He said he understood the water rights and the trade corridors and the Northwestern Alliance and what it meant for PAC stability. He said all of it without dismissing it, without pretending the stakes were not real. And then he said he would not do it. The room was very quiet. My father looked at his hands for a long moment. The Harmon territory will withdraw their trade cooperation, he said. Not necessarily, I said. Both of them looked at me. The Harmon match was designed to secure 3 water rights corridors and 2 northern trade routes, I said. That is a resource negotiation wearing a bonding ceremony, which means there are other ways to secure those resources that do not require Rhett to spend his life in an arrangement neither party actually chose. I kept my voice even. Serena Harmon did not look like a woman in love tonight. She looked like a woman performing a function she had been assigned, which means she is also a person in this equation who has not been asked what she wants. My father studied me. You parsed the entire political architecture of tonight's dinner, he said. I had a lot of time at the far end of the table, I said. Something in his expression shifted. The calcified guilt from the amber corridor was still there, would probably be there for a long time, but underneath it something was moving. The slow, careful movement of a man beginning the process of actually seeing his son. What do you propose? He said. Open a direct resource negotiation with the Harmon territory, I said, separate from any bonding arrangement. Offer them the eastern port access they have wanted for 6 years in exchange for the northern trade corridors. It is a cleaner deal and both territories get something they actually need without anyone's future being the currency. Silence. And the crown prince's bonding status, my father said carefully. Rhett looked at me. I looked at the king. Remains his own business, I said, until he chooses otherwise. My father was quiet for a long time. Outside the study window, the October wind moved through the manor grounds and the last of the evening light pressed thin and gold through the curtains. Then he looked at Rhett. Really looked at him, the way I suspected he had not looked in a long time, the way fathers sometimes stop looking when they have convinced themselves that loving someone and managing their future are the same act. Is this what you want? He asked. Quiet. Direct. A real question. Rhett held his father's gaze. Yes, he said. One word. No performance. No political framing. Just yes, plain and honest and finally out loud where it could not be taken back. The king exhaled slowly. I will contact the Harmon territory in the morning, he said. The conversation will be delicate. I can prepare notes on the port access proposal tonight, I offered. Caleb can get me paper. My father looked at me with the particular expression of a man meeting someone for the first time who has technically been in his house for 17 years. You will prepare notes, he repeated. I have opinions about the Eastern Port access valuation that I think you will find useful, I said pleasantly. He stared at me for another moment. Then he laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him, rusty at the edges from apparent disuse, but genuine. The laugh of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be caught off guard in a good way. Go, he said. Both of you. I need to think. We went. The corridor outside the study was dim and quiet. Most of the palace staff retired or preparing the guest wings for the overnight delegates. The sounds of the evening had softened into the particular hush of a large building settling into itself. Rhett and I walked without a destination for a moment, just side by side in the quiet. That went better than expected, he said. I had a strong proposal, I said. You had a proposal ready in real time, in an unplanned conversation, for a 3-territory political realignment. I told you I notice most things. He stopped walking. I stopped beside him. We were at the top of the main staircase, moonlight coming through the tall window at the landing, falling in long pale shapes across the floor. It made everything look like something out of a story, which I supposed was appropriate. Rhett turned to face me. In the moonlight his eyes were more green than gray, and he was not wearing any expression I had seen on him today. Not the ceremony face or the corridor face or the balcony face. Something newer. Something that looked like a man standing in his own life for the first time in a while and finding it larger than he remembered. I don't know how to do this slowly, he said. I should. I know I should. Today was one day and I am aware of how that sounds. It sounds accurate, I said. I don't want to rush something that deserves more than that. I agree completely, I said. We should take our time, build something real, let it happen at a pace that makes sense. He nodded. Yes, exactly. Starting tomorrow, I said, his mouth curved. Starting tomorrow. Tonight you can just... I stopped. Just what? He said softly. I looked at him in the moonlight with cedar and pine and that warm low note that my nervous system had apparently decided was home, and I thought about 2 lifetimes and 1 morning and a corridor and a cold balcony and a red recorder light and a laugh surprised out of a tired king and a boy who had been made invisible for 5 years standing in midnight blue with his spine straight. Tonight you can just stand here, I said. And I will stand here. And we don't have to call it anything yet. Rhett looked at me for a long quiet moment. Then he reached out and took my hand. Not the back of his knuckles this time. His whole hand, warm and certain, folding around mine like something that had decided to stay. Okay, he said simply. We stood at the top of the staircase in the moonlight, and neither of us said anything else for a while. Outside, the October wind moved through the New Hampshire tree line. Inside, the manor settled around us, large and old and full of rooms that had been deciding what we were before we had the chance to decide it ourselves. We had taken that back today. Not cleanly. Not without cost. My father still had a difficult phone call in the morning. Harrington still had a revised plan somewhere, cold and patient. The packed territories were still full of people who looked at an omega and saw a designation instead of a person. But standing here with my hand in his and the moonlight doing what moonlight does, all of that felt like weather. The kind you walk through rather than around. I had died on I-95 with a playlist I never finished. I had woken up as a boy everyone had agreed to forget. And I had spent 1 day in a palace in New Hampshire being exactly who I was, loudly and without apology, until the right person looked up and finally actually saw it. Not bad, I thought. For day 1. Rhett's thumb moved slowly across my knuckles. I held on.